Hi, welcome to our presentation, When Senses Don't Make Sense, a discussion of sensory processing disorders. I grew up in a world of sensory overload. Every sound was like a fire alarm. The labels on my clothes clawed at me. Bright lights startled and blinded me. And the worst part was that no one seemed to believe me. Noise? What noise? John Robison. As children, we are taught the five senses: touch, taste, sight, hearing, and smell. We go through life thinking that these are the five senses. The quote above from Robison seems to be quite fitting and helpful to understand the experience of a person with a difficulty with processing sensory information. Sure, things are going to be extra loud if you can't process the information correctly, or your shirt tags are going to bother you. You're not going to like hot. You're not going to like cold. You're going to be overwhelmed in crowds. Makes sense. Well, the trouble with that is that it's only a piece of the puzzle. There's a lot more to sensory processing disorders than just oversensitivity. Additionally, there are more senses than just the five that we're familiar with. Boutot and Miles cite 7 sensory systems in their book. The 7 systems that they discuss are auditory, visual, tactile, gustatory, olfactory, vestibular, and proprioceptive. Auditory, of course, is our hearing sense. Visual deals with sight. Tactile deals with our touch. Gustatory deals with things that go into our mouth: touch, taste, temperature. Olfactory deals with things that we're smelling. Vestibular deals with our balance. And proprioceptive is new to us, and it deals with our skeletal movement and orientation. Basically, proprioception is the way that your body senses how it is moving. It receives information from the joints, tendons, and muscles and processes that to know if your arm is bent or straight, for example, or if your left foot is a few inches from your right foot, or if it's a few centimeters from your right foot. All of that information and perception is pulled together to help you make coordinated motor movements throughout your day. If you have trouble with processing this information, you are going to be clumsy, and you may not use pressure appropriately. Maybe you try to pick up a plastic cup and you squeeze it too hard because you don't realize how hard you're pressing on the cup, or you break pencils because you don't realize that you're pressing down as hard as you are. There are more difficulties that can be involved in it as well, some related to gait and other things like that. These 7 systems are included in the sensory processing disorders that were described by Miller et al. And cited by Boutot and Miles. Upon further research, I have found that there was an 8th sense recently added to Miller's list. This 8th sense is known as interoception. It deals with sensing things that are taking place within your body, things that no one else will be able to see but the person experiencing them. Examples include itch, hunger, thirst, illness, heart rate, bladder fullness, and respiration. So maybe your foot itches, but nobody's going to know that but you. Well, if you're not very interoceptive, then you may not know your foot itches until it's very, very itchy. Or if maybe you're not very interoceptive, you don't realize that your bladder is too full until it's too late. Interoception is also connected with making choices. This idea has been a long-standing debate. Dunn et al. Said that it goes back to Descartes and possibly even beyond. But the idea is that your body is actually giving you biofeedback about the environment and about the decisions that you're going to make, and helping you to make decisions that are good decisions. If you're really tuned into your body, then you will be able to sense what your body's telling you. And we kind of think of it as intuition. Dunn and colleagues set out to decide if intuition and heart rate really are connected. They were trying to add some research to this idea that gut feelings aren't just a myth, and it's not just nerves that are causing these gut feelings that we have, or when we say we know something, our heart just knows that this is the right decision. Their research showed that, in fact, intuition and heart rate are connected. Now that we've discussed what the senses are and we've added a few to our knowledge base, let's discuss what happens when they aren't functioning properly. When sensory information is not interpreted correctly by your body and your brain to a sort of extreme degree on a regular basis, that's known as a sensory processing disorder. Most people who are affected with sensory processing difficulties are affected in more than one area. So perhaps they're over-responsive to touch, but they're under-responsive to sound. Sensory processing disorder, however, is not a recognized diagnosis in the DSM. There are estimates that between 5 and 16% of all children have some sort of sensory processing disorder. This figure is the breakdown of the different sensory processing disorders as described by Miller. You'll see sensory modulation disorders are over-responsivity, under-responsivity, and sensory craving. Sensory-based motor disorders are dyspraxia and postural disorder. And sensory discrimination disorder includes each of the senses. First, let's discuss sensory modulation disorders. Sensory over-responsivity, sensory under-responsivity, and sensory craving. Sensory over-responsivity is also known as sensory defensiveness. Have you ever been sick and your skin was very sensitive and you just didn't want your clothes touching you or your blanket touching you? That was an example of sensory over-responsivity in the tactile system. If you've ever had a headache and you've been lying down on the couch with all the lights off in a quiet room, and then your roommate walks in and throws on the lights and cranks up the radio, you are not going to be a happy camper. You are going to feel a little defensive. And that is exactly how our children who have over-responsivity feel when their sense is overloaded. If they have sensory over-responsivity to tactile stimulation and something touches them too much, they kind of can't really deal with all that. They don't know what to do with that information. It's too much. It's overwhelming, and they start to react with fight or flight mechanisms, and that could be any number of things, but it's the same kind of reaction in your head that is happening when you have a really bad headache and you just want to lie in a dark, quiet room, and somebody all of a sudden comes in and makes it a bright, loud room. That's what our children are feeling. The quote from Robinson at the beginning of the presentation is a pretty good first-hand explanation of what it's like to have a lot of sensory over-responsivity. Now, over-responsivity with respect to the gustatory system can have dietary effects. Children with sensory over-responsivity in the gustatory system are usually pretty picky. They may not like the texture of their food. Maybe they only want things that feel like mashed potatoes. Perhaps they only want cool foods, not cold foods, not hot foods. Perhaps the smell of cinnamon makes them sick to their stomach, or maybe the taste of sweet potatoes makes them sick. These things can be quite frustrating if you don't understand what's happening and you just have a child who is refusing to eat and you don't understand why they're refusing to eat. You think they're just being difficult. Parents can help the kids to overcome this by introducing new foods that are prepared to mimic the foods that the child is already eating. So perhaps if the child likes things that are bland because they're over responsive to different tastes, then the parents can cook lots of things that are kind of bland flavored and then increase the flavor a little bit at a time. If they only like purees, then perhaps you could try squash puree to go with the applesauce that they already eat to open their palates to new flavors, since you know that that's a texture that they like. Occupational therapists and registered dietitians are also a helpful part of the team when a child has gustatory over-responsivity, because they can help you learn ways to increase the exposure to different foods. And also the registered dietitian can help to ensure that the child is getting adequate nutrition by looking at what they're eating and filling in things that are similar in taste or texture that will have the nutrients that may be missing because they're leaving out some other textures. Next on our list is sensory under-responsivity. This is a decrease in the ability to perceive the sensory information. So this is the opposite of over-responsivity. This is when the student maybe doesn't notice things when they change around him. The things need to be pointed out to him. They need more intense input of sensory information to fill up their sensory cup, per se. And this can be associated with sensory seeking behavior. Sometimes they need that sensory and so they crave it. We'll discuss that more in a moment. If you've ever worn earplugs or your ears have been filled with fluid when you were sick, or you had an ear infection, or maybe your sinuses were kind of draining some fluid down, that is going to mimic sensory under-responsivity in the auditory area. And it's only for a short time, but that's still that. If you've ever worn earplugs or your ears have ever been filled with fluid and it was kind of hard to hear things, you've experienced temporary auditory under-responsivity because things had to be louder for you to be able to perceive them happening. Sometimes your arm or your leg might fall asleep because you've been lying on it the wrong way, and you can poke it and try to wake it up, or pinch it and pull on it, and you really can't feel anything. It's just numb completely. That's also a good example of what it would feel like to be tactile under responsive. Alright, I said that we'd come back to craving senses, and now it's time to come back to that. Sensory craving or sensory seeking. Some children may have just this burning desire to have a sensory need met, and they have to have that met. They hunger for it, and that's all they can really think about until they get that need met. Some of the sensory seeking behaviors may be seen as a student that spins or rocks or flaps their hands in front of their face. All of these are sensory craving or sensory seeking behaviors. Think back to a time when you just needed a hug. That's all you needed. You just wanted somebody to come and wrap their arms around you. Or maybe you wanted to go for a run. You just needed to feel the wind on your face, and you needed to feel that motion, your legs moving, the blood pumping through your body. That is a craving. That's a sensory craving. When you were longing for a hug, you were longing for that person to put their arms around you, to have that tactile input. When you're longing to go for a run, maybe you are craving the proprioceptive input of your muscles moving in that running motion. Maybe you're craving the visual input from seeing the scenes around you. Maybe you're craving the vestibular motion input. Those are things that you are craving, and that's the same thing that happens for a child with sensory cravings. Until that need is met, you can try all these other things, but nothing's really going to fill up that until you achieve the thing that you want. These responses are not the same all the time. Our kids are such wonderful little people, and they are dynamic. They don't stay the same from one minute to the next, just like a child without autism spectrum disorders. These kids with the sensory processing difficulties, maybe they're over-responsive to some stimuli and under-responsive to other stimuli. While they still have this little group of stimuli that they're totally normal in responding to. And of course, some times of the day, you're more sensitive to other things, like when you first wake up. Maybe you're more sensitive to light, and so you keep the lights off in the bathroom while you're brushing your teeth in the morning. It's the same with these kids. Or maybe if you're at a concert, you are not very sensitive to noise because it's really loud, and so you're blocking everything out. Or when you're trying to concentrate to do a project for college, you're really sensitive to everything, and everything kind of bothers you more than it would if you were watching a movie. It's the same with these kids. It's not going to be static across time and settings. It's going to change based on where they are and how they're feeling. Alright, now moving on to the second category of sensory processing disorders is sensory-based motor disorders. Now, these are only dyspraxia and postural disorder. Dyspraxia is dealing with the movement of the body and the muscles. These kids are going to have to concentrate on how to move their bodies. They have to do the planning. It doesn't happen automatically for them a lot of times. And it can make everyday activities difficult, like making lunch, getting dressed, putting your pants on the right way. Postural disorder is difficulty using your body against gravity. So sometimes sitting up in a chair is very difficult, or sitting up straight can be hard. These are things that you might see as a child slumping in their seat if they have a postural disorder. The last category of sensory processing disorders that is described by Miller are sensory discrimination disorders. And this disorder can affect any combination of the senses, and it is a difficulty in telling the difference in stimuli. So letters, sounds, directions, temperatures, taste, texture. Maybe the child can't tell the difference in a B and a D. Maybe they can't tell if you said cat or cap. Or they can't tell if somebody touched their right shoulder or their left. They're not sure if you touch them with a warm washcloth or a cool washcloth. They can't tell the difference in rough and smooth. It feels the same to them. Bitter and sweet may taste the same. These kids are going to need longer processing time in a lot of cases, because they're having to think about if they're different and try to discriminate. It's not automated for them. They can't just look at this stuff and immediately understand it. It takes them a few minutes to really work through it with their brain. Now, sensory processing disorder, I mentioned earlier that it is not recognized in the DSM as a disorder. Just recently, the American Academy of Pediatrics issued a policy statement that recognizes sensory processing difficulties in children. They mention that the sensory processing disorder is not listed in the DSM, but that for children 0 to 3, there are diagnostic manuals which list a disorder known as regulatory sensory processing disorder. But still, there are no criteria for children over 3 or for adults. We're still working toward sensory processing disorder becoming a recognized diagnosis. One of the reasons that sensory processing disorder has not been recognized as its own diagnosis is there is some thought that it may always be comorbid with something else. So perhaps it is a symptom of sorts of autism spectrum disorders. Perhaps it is a symptom of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and not a separate disorder in itself. They don't see it outside of a comorbid disorder normally. Sensory difficulties are a part of the proposed DSM-5 autism spectrum disorders criteria. There is debate on whether this should be included because some people would say that not all children with autism spectrum disorders have sensory difficulties. They think that it may not be a reliable differentiator between a typical child and a child with autism. So we really do need to continue the research in this area to see exactly what needs to be done with our definition. Now, in the classroom and at home, we can make some accommodations for these kids with sensory processing disorders. And accommodations are just small things we can do. It's not huge, over-the-moon things. Some examples are letting them get up and move from their seat throughout the day, allowing them to bounce their feet while they're in their seat, sitting them on a balance ball, have them put away the books, like to have them do what's called heavy work. So maybe if you have a stack of books that needs to go on the shelf, ask the child to put them away, and that gives them some input. Keeping pet fish in the classroom or at home can be helpful because it's visual stimuli and it's kind of calming. Some other accommodations are called fidgets, and I'm going to give you some examples of those because fidgets is a little bit of an interesting term, but basically it's something that you fidget with. It's something small to help the kid remain on task. Some examples might be Play-Doh for tactile input. Smooth stones could also be for tactile input. That's something that even an accommodation that I gave myself, or my husband rather gave me my first semester of college. I would get nervous during tests, so my husband bought me a bag of stones to have during class. I could have one stone during class and it would keep me on task. A visual fidget example would be a lava lamp. Kids who like to chew on things, you could give them a drinking straw to chew on. You could fill a sock with rice or beans or grain, something like that, and let them put it on their lap. That would give them some deep pressure input. If you'd like more examples, there are 45 examples in the ebook by Beck. Interventions are more complicated than just the accommodations, and they do need to be carefully implemented by a trained professional. These aren't things that we need to have parents doing without a professional guiding them. Some examples include the ALERT program, animal therapy, collaboration, and sensory integration therapy. Collaboration is something that is what teachers tend to do anyway. We talk among ourselves about the different things that may be working or not working, and we collaborate with the parents and the other team members on the IEP team to find new activities for the child and keep them progressing. That's all that collaboration really is here as this intervention as well. The ALERT program is a program that teaches the child to tune into his own engine and decide if his engine is running just right, too fast, or too slow. So he's tuning into his interoceptive sense and deciding if his body is tuned correctly or if maybe he's a little too excited or not excited enough. Then he picks out some sort of a tool to help himself get tuned up so that he's running just right. Another intervention is animal therapy. One example is therapeutic horseback riding. I actually have a friend who is soon going to put her son into therapeutic horseback riding. There was a pilot study by Gabriels and colleagues in 2011 that found that therapeutic horseback riding can be effective in improving self-regulation. But when they teased out the time factor, they discovered that the other things that had improved possibly just improved because of time and weren't really an effect of the intervention. However, self-regulation did improve more in their study group than it did in their control group. We do still need more studies on that because, of course, that was just one small pilot study. Wuto and Miles cite a few studies that have found that animal therapy is effective in increasing social skills and language in children with autism spectrum disorders. And next on our list of interventions is sensory integration therapy. This is a widely used therapy. There are occupational therapists all over the country that are using this in different forms. It's very, very popular, and they seem to feel that they are getting great results from it. It is based on the idea that if you expose the body to different sensory input, sensory stimuli, if you will, then the body will learn to recognize and correctly process that information. There is limited supporting data for this, but it is still used by a large percentage of occupational therapists. The American Academy of Pediatrics recognizes that sensory integration therapy can be beneficial to some children. Some of the things that are included or could be included in sensory integration therapy, as discussed by the American Academy of Pediatrics in their policy statement, are swings and therapy balls and brushes. Swings would be for vestibular integration, the brushing would be tactile, and the therapy balls, depending on how they were used, could be used for different senses. So what did we learn from all this information? What exactly do we know now? Well, sensory processing disorders are complex. Like many things in the field of autism, there's no simple, easy answer. More things in life are affected by these sensory processing disorders than I would have originally thought. I'm sure when a layman hears the term sensory processing disorder, they think of, the five senses, and they assume that that's going to be it, but they don't think about the proprioceptive sense and how your senses really affect your ability to walk and your ability to articulate words. These are not things that we generally associate with our senses, but they really are associated. Accommodations can be put in place in the classroom and at home to help children with sensory processing disorders to function in a more typical fashion. There are also interventions that can be implemented by therapists, even though we have limited research on them, and we do need to be careful when we're implementing these and monitor the progress and adjust the therapy as needed. If we see that something's not working, it needs to be removed or done in a different fashion. Thank you very much for attending the session today on sensory processing disorders. I trust that you have found this information to be helpful in understanding it. For further information, you can see the references that I have listed here. or feel free to comment or contact me. Thanks, and have a good night.